Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today we have distinguished guest, Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Oh, thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here.
Great to have you, Jonathan. Listen, I've developed my own, so to speak, conspiracy theory about what's happening right now in Ukraine. Not right now, but in the last several months. So every time the United States, NATO, they are discussing with Ukraine some new weapon systems delivered to Ukraine. So the discussion, delivery, implementation takes several months in each case, whether it's HIMARS, whether it's newer systems like Scalp from France and other. I will not even mention many other systems, but basically same thing happened all the time. What's happened is that it allows Russians to build quite formidable fortifications. They mine all the 200,000 square kilometers, make it extremely difficult for Ukraine to go ahead. And actually, interestingly enough, Ukrainians were quite successful last year in Kharkiv and Kherson without all these newest weaponry systems, but because Russians were unable to build these fortifications, Ukrainians were very successful in both cases. So now, when finally, after several months, Ukrainians are getting these newest systems, there are so much fortifications. Russians still have a huge superiority in the air. So my theory is that there is unspoken, and in some cases actually spoken, desire to get some kind of a deadlock on the front lines, moving Ukrainians to consider actually some kind of arrangements, peace arrangements, or temporary ceasefire arrangements with Russia. Of course, Ukrainians are not in a position to consider that, because any peace negotiations with Russia is going just to a new war. We know all that. But that's not the point. The point is that now, with the latest NATO summit, so the position of NATO and the United States is, okay, guys, you go and win the war, and then you will become a member of NATO. Never mind that if Ukraine will win the war against Russia, I don't understand why Ukrainians need NATO, period. Furthermore, how Ukrainians are going to win war if under any military doctrine of the United States and NATO, you have to have a huge superiority in the air before you start frontline attack, and that's what Ukraine would like to do. So, therefore, attack is impossible. The penetration of Russian lines is impossible. So, guys, that's no problem. We'll help you with the peace arrangements with Russia. Maybe this is, in my conspiracy theory, is exactly what West, NATO, United States, all they are doing, pushing Ukraine to peace with Russia. However, I must say that I myself I'm going to defeat this conspiracy theory very easily by the fact that you can see a great progress of Ukrainian army in the last couple of days without ATACMS, without F-16s, and going against all military doctrines of NATO and the United States. And they are actually proceeding ahead and very forcefully. Jonathan, what you will make out of it all?
Well, I don't disagree. I don't agree with the conspiracy theory aspect.
Okay.
Number one, that the United States and NATO did not anticipate this war properly to begin with. They did not anticipate having to supply all these weapon systems to Ukraine. They did not foresee that. They did not foresee Ukrainian success. They did not foresee Russian incompetence. They did not foresee Russian miscalculation and the over-reliance of Putin on his nuclear arsenal as a means of intimidation. They did not anticipate any of these things. However, the Ukrainian army right now, in my perception, is on the verge of achieving a major operational objective, which is the severing of supply between the Crimea and Russia. Severing of that final link. It's already been severely damaged, and the Ukrainian forces are making progress towards severing that final link. They have not committed. They still cannot committed a significant portion of their reserves. So, which they've been affirming the strategy that I've been talking about over the past several months, which is launching a series of reconnaissance in force, probing, making progress where they can, all the while looking for the opportunity to launch the main punch and commit their final reserves. So once they do that, once they commit their final reserves, which I anticipate will be to finally sever the Crimea from Russia, that will be a major operational victory right there, because then, the Russians lose the Crimea, their forces are cut off, the occupants or whatever is left of the garrison there is compelled to surrender, and that is a severe blow to Russian ambitions. And the remaining occupied forces, it's been pointed out by an observer that Ukraine has recovered nearly half of the territory that Russia has occupied, and so they're in an excellent position. I believe Secretary of State Blinken has pointed out that they are in an excellent position to recover even more territory, and the pacing and the timing. It looks like it to an outside observer, it looks like a conspiracy or someone who's, but it really isn't. It's too chaotic. It's too unplanned, and the success of the Ukrainians, despite the less than full unqualified support of NATO and the U.S., they're still getting enough support. They are making the best use of what they have, and that is, and it continues to exceed the expectations of both NATO and the U.S., and for that matter, it certainly has surprised the living daylights out of the Russians. So, it is the Russians are not in a position to win the war. They are not. They are counting on the West giving them at a peace table what they could not get on the battlefield. So basically, Ukraine has to be persistent and patient and concentrate on severing the Crimea from Russian control, for Russian resupply and reinforcement, and it will fall into Ukrainian hands. And the U.S. and NATO will find themselves de facto victors in this operational in this war of Putin's. So that is essentially my take on it. The people who are saying that the offensive is proceeding too slowly. Oh, really? And how much knowledge of military operations do you have that tells you what pace a military operation should proceed? Tell us from your vast experience with these matters. So these people are simply they're expressing dissatisfaction. Matter of fact, Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, whom you've seen as a commentator on CNN, he has said that even though that the offensive is proceeding slowly, slower than some people expect, it is proceeding quite well from his perspective, from his experience as a commander of U.S. Army Europe. So, I tend to agree with General Hertling. So, I think there are always a wide variety of opinions, people who are sitting on the sidelines as spectators. I mean, the military experts are all over the place. If you were to go back and read newspapers during the American Civil War on both sides, both Union and Confederate, oh my goodness, over every little thing, military experts, so-called military experts, were all over the place. I mean, you just kick the wall and a whole bunch of military analysts would fall out. So, no, I'm not impressed by what I see as a lot of military analysts trying to say that the offensive is proceeding too slowly. Yeah, well, they've never had to conduct one.
I think in the last 2 days, actually, the camp of those who believe that offensive is proceeding too slowly, I think started to really bleed, simply because offensive only now shows its true colors, and only now we can see how effective it is. And in the next few days, it will be even far more strong and effective. That's what I believe. Now, there is a great information war is going, and one person that I'm listening daily, sometimes twice a day, is the analyst with the name Mr. Schwetz. And he is very well connected. He is in Washington, D.C., former KGB officer and operative, but he's in USA close to 30 years. And of course, he's well engraved into U.S. Strategic positions and consulting work and many others. So he's quite influential. And he is looking far beyond what you can read in average newspaper and so on. And he's not only tells us what's happening, but why is it happening, who are the actors behind that, and so on. So he was telling yesterday a very interesting story. Apparently, first time he just told the story. He didn't have sources, of course, the players behind it and how it all happened. I'll just very briefly explain what I'm talking about. Three so-called journalists, two from the United States and one from Poland, they got into Ukrainian front lines and for a matter of a few days were able to conduct interviews with Ukrainian fighters, officers, and so on and on. Then they submitted their vision of what's happening, and essentially it all boils down that Russians have incredible fortifications. Ukrainians will not be able to penetrate them, that they just don't have enough power, they don't have any, and the higher officers in Ukrainian army, because on the lower level, they are very committed and they're trying to do anything what they can. On the higher level, officers are incompetent, and with these officers, so Ukraine will never be able to achieve victory. Okay, that's fine. Go a little bit further. The paper Wall Street Journal published a material which had this as a base, but they also made their own commentaries on that. That was published just a few days ago, 2-3 days ago, not too long ago. And in the second part of his broadcast, Mr. Schwetz, he came down to analyze through his sources in Ukraine defense how the three, so let's call them journalists, could go in the front lines and allowed to take interviews with soldiers, officers, or so on. And they went through all chain of commands, who could authorize it, how it all happened. And of course, at the end of the day, it could happen only from the office of Mr. Yermak, who is second or maybe even first in command in Zelensky's presidency. Because all businesses, everything is going through Mr. Yermak. So Schwartz comes to the conclusion that, and Yermak already know, letters were submitted by FBI and CIA to Zelensky, the 50 plus people who have to be removed as soon as possible. Mr. Yermak is always number one. So here comes a contradiction. If Mr. Zelensky is unwilling or unable to remove Yermak and several others, how it will be bode well with American establishment uh, trying to help Ukraine? What do you think?
Well, it's just going to be a matter of the Ukrainian military proving Mr. Yermak wrong, and he will once the Ukrainian military achieves its operational objectives and severs Crimea from Russian resupply and reinforcement. I think that the other events will follow in their course, and it will prove to be irrelevant. So right now, the focus is on the Ukrainian armed forces and whether or not they can quickly sever the Crimea from Russian resupply. That is the main focus.
Okay, I agree with you, Jonathan. The battlefield, that's where it's all going to be decided. And the only concern is that Ukrainians can run fairly soon, in about a couple of months, out of money and therefore weapons, ammunition. And now the talk is about that it's a long time ago when Lend-Lease for Ukraine has been approved but never used because supposedly Biden was successful always extract more money from the Congress and so on. So there was essentially argument could be that there was no need for using Lend-Lease because all the other money are coming. However, there might be a situation when the money would not come as easily as before with all this Biden's problem with his son business and accusations and so on. There are talks about possible impeachment and so on. So in the meantime, Lend-Lease is almost like an endless way to finance this war, which Biden could use if he wanted. Looks like he doesn't want it at this time. What do you think and what do you know about the Lend-Lease?
Well, I don't really have enough insight into that to comment effectively. However, the American willingness to supply these high technology weapon systems, they can do this up to a point, but because they did not anticipate such a heavy drawdown on the existing stocks, eventually it is going to be a calculation within the Pentagon of, okay, how much can we draw down our existing stocks, knowing that it's going to take several years to replace these particular weapon systems, and how big a risk is there of the United States itself having to confront a major military threat, for example, with China, or if China decides to attempt to retake Taiwan, they have to calculate: will the United States, oddly enough, be forced to use lower technology systems or older reserve stocks of weapons for its troops in the event that they get caught short? That the probability of that happening, in my view, is rather low. So right now they are going to, even though they recognize the danger of being caught short, they are going to continue to supply Ukraine, especially, and the key variable is the success of Ukraine on the battlefield. It all comes back to that. If Ukraine gains greater than expected success, if the pace of its offensive speeds up, they cut off the Crimea, and they begin in the Russian armed forces currently in these fortifications. Fortifications behind minefields, okay, fine, but if the forces are of lower quality and of such low morale that a determined attack causes them to break and run, then that's not really, the fortifications themselves do not really mean much. I mean, the French relied too much on the Maginot Line in World War II. And what did the Germans do? They bypassed the Maginot Line. And, that was just, it was just all useless. So fortifications and minefields, okay. In that it didn't work too well for the German Africa Corps in North Africa either. They they had minefields, but the British were able to bypass them. They had and Montgomery had plenty of supplies with which to mount his eventual counteroffensive. It too was slow moving, but it was effective.
Well, don't forget that there is a lot of available real estate in Africa, so they could go left and right and never deal with this fortification.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm not impressed by people, and also keep in mind that in the Persian Gulf War, the Iraqis had fortifications, they had fortified lines, which Western analysts thought, oh, U.S. troops are going to be confronting, and Marines are going to be confronting these heavily fortified positions. And Schwarzkopf just bypassed the whole thing with the famous end run, and just caught them completely by surprise.
And of course, it has huge superiority in the air.
Right. Exactly.
Was helpful.
So each situation is unique. Each situation is different. So in the case of Ukraine, they have been pursuing the prudent strategy all along, probing carefully and moving carefully and not committing their reserve until they are as close to certain as possible of committing that reserve in the area which will give them the greatest operational success. And I predict or assess that it will be in making that final cutoff of the Crimea from Russian resupply.
Excellent. And I would like to actually, Jonathan, to disagree with you.
Okay.
How dare I?
How dare you? How dare you, sir? Okay, those are fighting words. All right, go ahead.
I would like to disagree with you that you're saying that the U.S. and NATO did not expect this war and such ferocity or so on. I would like to remind you, I saw one very interesting video just a couple of days ago, where they show a month before the beginning of the war on February 24th, last month or even a little bit longer before the 24th of February, and what was happening each day in diplomacy and elsewhere. And they showed that every day, while Zelensky was denying the warnings that the war is about to start, and he's saying, oh, you're just mixing this theories, and you are chasing away the business from Ukraine, this should stop, and so on. And in the meantime, US were very pragmatic. It doesn't matter what Zelensky says. Almost every day, several warplanes were landing in Borispol, which is Kiev's airport, with ammunition, with weapons. At that time, it was Stingers, of course, and other systems. So United States not only was worrying about the beginning of war almost to the day and the hour, but they were taking very tangible steps in order to help Ukrainians almost against their own will. At that time, very interesting diplomacy of CIA Director Burns, who traveled at the time to Moscow and had meetings with Russian leadership, and all what he was trying to say, because the war was already imminent, he was trying to set the rules of war. First of all, to make it not the war, but a special operation. And in opinion of the same Schwetz, the Burns was very successful in his trip to Moscow. Now, some people believe that Burns is playing both sides, and the Russian, Ukrainian, and so on. What's your opinion, actually, on Burns? And do you think he's a villain or he's a great politician?
Hard to say. You're correct. You're I agree with you in that he seems to be trying to play off both sides and appear as even-handed as possible. and apparently he's doing it very well. So
Yeah.
I can't disagree with it. But it's always extremely difficult to read the inner motives of people while they are engaged in the process. I mean, you have to rely on, in order to get more insight, you often have to rely on historical accounts and historical analyses of these same people in the context of everything that has happened. And just to give you an example, in North Africa, World War II, and the North African Desert Campaign, we have now gotten, as a result of very detailed historical analyses, what was going on both sides while Rommel was conducting his operations in Africa. And you could see how panicked the Western Allies were, even though were getting significant access to German communications through the use of ultra, and they were decoding them. But it was a very, very big challenge. And they were fortunate that the Germans were very careless in their operational security procedures, which they fell into patterns, which enabled the Allies to repeatedly break the code. But I digress. And so right now, as we look at it from our perspective, looking on the surface of what is going on, it is very, very difficult to figure out motives of the various players. It is a very complex thing, and that will not be fully discerned until years after the conflict has ended, and we're able to go back and do lessons learned and be able to figure out what people were thinking at the time that these things were going on. So right now, trying to read the tea leaves and discern the innermost motives and thinking of the various actors, it's a case of your guess is as good as mine. So,
Jonathan, would you just touch the African campaign in Second World War? Would you agree that if Germans would overtake Malta, they would be successful in their African campaigns and could go as far as Baku, Azerbaijan?
well, now that's interesting because the the big problem with the Germans' campaign in North Africa is that it was very, in any case, it would have been, even if the Germans had devoted more effort, the logistical constraints that were operating on the Germans what made it very difficult for them to sustain a campaign in Africa. And yes, in order for them to have had a chance of succeeding, they would have had to consistently and suppress Malta so that they could get supplies across to the German Africa Corps and the Italians.
And English would be cut of their supplies.
Right. And yes, and divert, for example, matter of fact, if the Germans had decided to divert part of their U-boat fleet to suppressing British resupply to the Mediterranean forces, that also would have had a major effect. But the Germans were focused on trying to starve the British Isles themselves with their U-boats. So they did not have a large enough U-boat fleet in order to be able to attain both objectives. It is estimated by Little Hart, the British historian on the Second World War, the Germans would needed a U-boat fleet of 300 U-boats in order to be able to fully achieve its objectives of starving out Great Britain and using it for, as was, they never came close to that. They had their greatest successes in 1943, where they were sinking about 600,000 tons a month at one point, which was close to the threshold needed to starve out Great Britain. But at that same time, the Allied anti-submarine warfare procedures were starting to become very effective as well. So, yes, it is possible that doing a what if, and there are plenty of mechanisms for wargaming this, but had the Germans concentrated more on logistically suppressing British reinforcements to North Africa by suppressing Malta, and had they been able to get through, make that final breakthrough to Alexandria, then yes, according to the histories that we now know of what was going on, the Allies would have been panicked. They were preparing to evacuate all those areas, and they were And so, with a greater Rommel's intercepts were telling him that the Allies were completely unprepared, and he was driving ahead with his offensive. But unfortunately, he did not have the logistics to sustain it, and so he thought it was open, but as it turned out, he didn't have the logistics to sustain the drive all the way through into the Middle East.
So even if they would drive all through the Middle East, in some cases they could go through Caucasus, in some cases maybe through Iran, and then from Iran to Baku. But don't forget, not many people remember that Iran was already occupied by Red Army at that time. Iran was almost like a Soviet territory. That's why they had that meeting in 1943, because although there were German spies as well, as we know from famous movie Tehran 43, but Russian controlled that. Otherwise, Stalin would never ever go to the territory of Iran. So either through Iran or through Caucasus, they would meet their old friends, Soviet army anyway. So they met them in Stalingrad area, so they would meet them also in Caucasus area as well. So I hope that the Ukrainian attack is much more straightforward than attacks of Germans or allies in Africa, and they are fighting on their own territory, and they have incredible qualities that it's difficult to describe. We will put them all as intangibles, and that's what our Russians lack in big time.
Well, they could break through to cutting off the Crimea, the breakthrough to the coast, to cutting off that final bridge and destroying it, to cutting off the Russians in the Crimea from resupply and reinforcement. That is the key factor.
It is. Yeah.
That's what. Once we see that breakthrough occur, and the Russians acknowledge that they are cut off, and the Russian forces within Crimea, occupation forces, are compelled to surrender, then we have then that is the decisive event that I'm looking for.
Jonathan, would you agree that doing all that without superiority in the air, Ukraine redraws the loss of modern war, in a way?
Say again, please.
They are defying the loss of the modern war.
Yes, they are operating against the so-called conventional wisdom that they must have air superiority. What they have on their side is superior air defense. They have a shield under which to operate. The Russians aren't really able to attack from the air nearly as effectively as they would like. And they've sustained, the Russians are still continuing to sustain superior losses, regardless of these other things. So it's going to be and other observers have noted that the Russians are unable to switch their forces to reinforce threatened areas of the front. So unlike the Ukrainians, who have uncommitted reserves, fresh uncommitted reserves to follow up any tactical successes, or to make that final push when they need to. The Russians do not have that luxury. I mean, they have numbers, but they don't have quality.
Yeah. Jonathan, thank you so much for today's program.
Thank you.
Hope we'll have you on Tuesday next week, same time, same place. And I think by Tuesday we will definitely have a hell of a news.
I anticipate that we're going to see more good news on the operational front that will justify what we've been saying all along.
Yes, excellent. Jonathan, thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini. Bye-bye.